The following program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations. By PGBA, the healthcare claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. From the campus of Coastal Carolina University, the Center for Military and Veteran Studies is pleased to present Military Memoirs.
Hello and welcome to Military Memoirs. I'm Gragg, and on our program today we are talking to Alan Nagy, who was a combat infantryman during the Vietnam War and a radio operator. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Now, you told me earlier you are a native of Michigan.
That's
grew
correct.
Up there. And you went to college there at, you told me, Olivet College. How did you find yourself, and when did you find yourself in uniform and serving in the U.S. Army?
Well, when I was a sophomore in college, I got an induction notice, and I had to go take a physical. So I took my military physical, but meanwhile, the college president and others, being a small private college, wrote letters to my draft board saying I was a student in good standing, and why was I being drafted out of college? So the draft board reviewed that and responded and said, we'll classify you, I guess as S4 at that time, as a student. And so I was deferred, and I didn't give it another thought and didn't think a thing of it. I graduated in 1968 from college, and I had a teaching job. Before I ever graduated, they offered me a job at the school I was doing my student teaching at. And I signed a contract, and I taught for a year. At the end of that year, I was contacted by a principal at another school district and asked if I would consider applying for the head football coaching job at that school. But they were looking for a new head football coach and a physical education instructor, which was my major. I had a psychology major and phys ed major. So I applied, I interviewed. They offered the job to me. I took inventory of everything at the school. I hired a coaching staff. The day I got my contract, because the secretary had been on vacation, so she didn't send me my contract until late. The day I got my contract, I got my induction notice in the mail the same day. So I signed the contract, made a copy of it, took it to the draft board, and said, I'm under contract to teach. They reviewed it and said, you're going to have to go into the service. So I called the athletic director and the principal, because I had sent letters out to the student athletes and the parents for a meeting, and the night that I was supposed to have the meeting, the draft board contacted me and said that I was going to have to serve. I couldn't get out of it. So I said, there's not much reason for me to be at this meeting because I'm going to have to go into service. And that was in August of 1969.
And what was your thought about going at that point in time? I mean, the Vietnam War had been underway for more than 5 years. This was really at a peak, 69, and you had American military losses that were sometimes over 300 a week. So what were you thinking?
I've had a lot of privileges, and I live in a great country, so I guess it's my turn to serve. So I went to basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and then I went to infantry training in Fort Polk, Louisiana. It was, well, what was funny is I had a chance to be a helicopter pilot. They said, well, look, would you like to fly helicopters? You got a college degree and so on and so forth. We'll send you to helicopter school. I said, well, what do I got to do? Well, we'll send you to basic training now in Fort Polk instead of at Fort Knox. We'll send you to Fort Polk. And of course, being who I was and I knew that Fort Polk was not a very nice place to be. So I said, nah, I'll just stick it out here. Well, I ended up being sent to Fort Polk for infantry training anyway, so it didn't matter.
Well, what was basic training like in 1969 during the Vietnam War?
It's just, learning how to march, learning how to shoot, learning how to do all the things, learning the discipline of the military. Basic training is basic training. Yeah, you're indoctrinated into the military, into the armed forces, and you learn your chain of command, and you learn your orders, and you learn what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. And your back is covered by your friend, and you're covering their back, and you're just taught military etiquette and military protocol, and you're given all the basics, and you're taught how to fire a weapon and do all those kinds of things. So it's just common. It's not any different during any type of situation. The real difference comes in when you go into your MOS or your AIT, Advanced Infantry Training, or your MOS, which is your military occupational status. That's when you get down and dirty, and that's when you start learning where you got to go and what you got to do and how you got to do it.
Well, you were basically being trained to go to war in Vietnam.
Basically,
yep. And what were you trained to do as a soldier?
Well, I think you're trained to survive, and you're trained to inflict as much mayhem as you can on your enemy.
But you were trained in armor and as a
rifleman
as well.
I was trained as a rifleman, as an infantryman, and you're trained in all different kinds of things, because in the infantry you never know what you're going to end up having to do. So we shot M60 machine guns, and we were trained on M14s. I didn't get to M16s until I got to Vietnam, but we were trained with M14s and M60 machine guns and LAW, which is your handheld rocket launchers, and your M72 grenade launchers, and all those kinds of military things. And then you're trained to, how to survive in the jungle with what you got, and in case something happened, how to react and how to do it. Radios and everything. You're just trained.
Well, that M16 was the standard infantry weapon of the Vietnam War, and the enemy, both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Regular Army, the NVA, their standard weapon was an AK-47, a Kalashnikov, and that thing had a high rate of fire, very dependable, could take a real beating and keep on firing. How did the M16 compare to what the enemy had?
Well, the M16 was lighter. It was a lighter weapon to carry, but you had to be careful with it. It was temperamental. If you didn't keep it clean, and if you didn't carry your magazines in the right way, it would jam. It wouldn't work for you. So I cleaned my rifle every night. Every night at the end of the day, I cleaned it, made sure it was good and clean, and my magazines, they would hold 20 rounds, but I never put 20 rounds in them, because if you put 20 rounds in it, it could jam it. So I only carried 16 rounds in a magazine. And the AK-47, it would fire in mud, it would fire in anything, and it had a very distinct sound, and you got your head down when it was firing.
You went to Vietnam when?
I went to Vietnam in March of 1970.
Do you remember the day you arrived, what that was like?
March the 12th, I think it was. And
how did you get there?
Well, we flew commercially. All the troops that were sent at that point in time went with commercial airlines. And we landed in Benoit. And you fix in your mind what it's going to be like. Having never been there and not knowing, but only what you read, I thought, well, The plane will land, I'll have to jump off the plane, find the nearest weapon that I can find, and fight for a year and hope that I can get through it and get back on. You have no concept of what you're going to have to go through or what it's going to be like until you get there. So we land, and it's in this great big airport, and they march us into this center, and then they start dividing us into what units we're going to be going to. And I got sent to what's called the First Team Academy, which was the 1st Air Cav. And then we had to go through another 2 weeks of training, making sure we knew how to throw hand grenades. And then we were trained on shooting the M16 because I hadn't been trained on the M16 at all in the States. And then we had to learn how to repel in case we had to repel out of a helicopter because we're air mobile.
So you were the 5th Battalion,
7th Cav.
7th Cavalry Regiment, famous regiment that, and the 1st Cavalry Division.
Correct.
In the U.S. Army. They called that the 7th Air Cavalry.
Well, we were called the Gary Owen Battalion.
Right.
And Gary Owen was created by Custer, if you get back in your history.
His regimental theme song.
That was the theme song, the Gary Owen theme song, and Custer created all that. And we were called the Gary Owen Battalion. I got a pin on my Vietnam veteran hat that's the 5th, 7th, it's the Gary Owen Battalion, and then I got the 1st Cav pin.
Well, Custer and a large portion of the 7th Cavalry on June 25, 1876 were wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Did you ever think about that?
Yes, I
wonder
did.
If that was the kind of precedent your regiment
yeah, well, when they said I was going to be in the 7th Cav, I thought, is this where I really want to be? I hope they don't march into something unknowingly. But he was an aggressive bugger, and he didn't wait for the rest of his men to get there and went ahead full on and paid the price.
What you were going to see was some combat, and we're going to talk about that when we come back in just a moment.
Military Memoirs is produced by the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University and is made possible in part by the Lieutenant Tab Stogner Horry County Veterans Oral History Project, which is named in honor of the late H. Otis Tab Stogner, Jr., a World War II veteran of the United States Army. The project records and preserves oral history with Horry County veterans.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
The United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies preserves oral history from American veterans of all service branches, including the U.S. Coast Guard. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project is named in honor of the late Henry Hack Mintz, a longtime resident of Myrtle Beach who held 3 U.S. Coast Guard commands. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project, a key component of the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies.
Hello and welcome back to Military Memoirs. I'm Rod Gragg, and we're talking to Alan Nagy, who was a combat infantryman during the Vietnam War. Now, you were telling me before we began this program that you went in as a combat infantryman, as a rifleman, but then you had the opportunity to basically change jobs, but you chose something that was even more dangerous.
Well, I don't know if it's more dangerous. When I first got in country, for some reason, I decided to volunteer to walk point. So I walked point and back up. I figured if I'm going to be careful and I'm going to know what's going on, might as well know it first rather than last. I don't know if that's a good attitude or not, but that's what I did. And I did that for the first month or so in country. And in the field, and when I first went to the field, it was 52 days before we got out of the field and got my first shower. So I'm sure that I was pretty ripe by then. My hair had been growing, and it was nasty. I hadn't washed it, so when I got to the fire base after the first 52 days, I had my head shaved, so I didn't have any hair. I didn't want to have to deal with that.
But the action you were seeing basically was on when you were on patrol.
Usually if you're on patrol, that type of thing. Now, it was kind of interesting when I was in Vietnam. We didn't really see any activity. The biggest activity we saw is we got sent into an area that some pilot, I don't know if Air Force or Army or what it was, said that he came across some enemy and fired on them, and there should be some evidence of that. So they sent us into that area. All he did was shoot up some 50-gallon drums of CS gas, and we started choking and tears coming down, but we didn't see any other thing. He didn't really hit what he thought he'd hit. But that was the extent of our activity in Vietnam. We didn't really hit activity and serious activity until we got sent to Cambodia.
Well, let's talk about it in a minute. But first, we were talking about you changing your jobs. You volunteered to be a radio operator.
I did.
In combat. Now, veterans have told me that the enemy loved to see any kind of antenna, anybody with something on their back. They like to go after those radio operators, and you didn't have a life expectancy in combat that was really long.
No, but again, I guess that was my attitude is I want to know what's happening. And how better to know it than to be on the radio. So I decided that, they needed a radio man, so I volunteered to carry the radio. I was a squad RTO, and I carried what they called a Prick 25, and it added a few pounds to my pack. We got resupplied with food and water every 3 days. Wherever we were located, helicopters would bring out food and water. And for me to get through 3 days of water, I needed 10 quarts of water for 3 days. That's what it took me. Everybody was different, but for me, I needed 10 quarts of water. That was for some food and for drinking.
Well, in May of 1970, you were involved in what was known as the Cambodian incursion, and the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, the NVA regulars, they were putting a lot of people and weapons into Vietnam, into battle, coming through Cambodia.
Correct.
And so military command decided that to have a short-term operation in Cambodia. It's called the Cambodian incursion. It was controversial and famous and important, and you were involved in that. So when you got the word you're going into Cambodia, what did you think of that? I
was pretty scared. It was kind of unusual. We did what they call a combat assault, which means you're going by helicopter into a designated area, not knowing whether you were going to have to fight your way in, whether you were going to be able to get in, didn't have a clue what was going to happen. And it was the largest combat assault that I'd been involved with. There was waves of probably 10 to 15 helicopters flying in a V, and then they would fly into this open field, and then we would scatter into the tree line as quickly as possible to set up a perimeter for the next wave that's coming in. And then once everybody gets in, then we were divided up. We had companies. I was in Charlie Company, 5th and 7th. So Charlie Company got sent one direction, and every unit's got sent in different directions. And then we started our incursion into Cambodia.
But you were there to shut down a supply line, a huge supply line, and what did you find? You found the line, and what arms and equipment?
Well, we found all kinds of things. After about 4th or 5th day in country, then we started having contact on a daily basis. But we found caches of weapons. I ended up with 4 rifles. One of them I brought home. It was a sniper rifle. It was a bolt action, and I was able to do the paperwork and bring it home with me. And then I traded some of the other rifles to some Air Force people that were friends of mine for a few things. And then we found medical supplies. We found Jeeps. We found bicycles. We found clothing, sewing machines, machetes, and literally they were made and created from all countries all over the world. I mean, the Jeeps came out of Japan, the clothing and sewing machines came out of England, medical supplies came out of Canada.
So you were actually fighting an enemy that had been armed by some of the American allies. So when a roundabout
either
way.
through the black market or whatever
Right.
whatever ways they could get a hold
But
of
you were
things.
successful in shutting them down, at least for a time.
We destroyed a lot of things and we flew some things out.
Right. Now, do you remember when you engaged in your first, took your first fire coming in, what that was like?
All I can tell you is that I became very astute to the sound of an AK-47 very quickly. And you were always thankful that you heard the first round because that meant you didn't get hit right off the bat.
Well, what was typical contact like with the enemy?
Well, usually you got ambushed. You got ambushed by hit and run groups. They might be squads of half a dozen or something of that nature, and they knowing the terrain and they knowing the area and you're moving, they would always set up ambushes, and then we would at night would set up traps ourselves so we couldn't get ambushed at night. But we were constantly being hit in ambush type situations. Sometimes they would hit at the point of the unit and the point element. Unless you were at the point, you didn't get shot at particularly right at the bat, but you were protecting someone's back and someone was protecting your back, and you were watching to see if anybody was coming in your area. The only time you're really getting into really hard-nosed contact is if you were the point element, and that's where it got hit. And that just happened to me a couple, 3 times, and that was kind of wild.
You were in daily firefights, you say, for how many days in a row?
Probably 2.5 weeks.
Did you lose anybody there that you knew?
We
and
lost.
cared about?
I lost one good friend, but not because of enemy contact. It was because we had found a cache.
A cache.
A cache of materials. In other words, they buried materials. They would pack their weapons in cosmoline, which was a greasy, oily substance, to protect them from water and rusting and so forth. And then when they wanted them, they would go dig them up, clean them up, and then use them. And we found a lot of different caches like that with materials. And this one cache, might have been some weapons and different things that they wanted hauled out rather than destroyed. And we called in for a helicopter to come in, cut a pad, and we were carrying some of the material to this helicopter pad. And we had a cart, found a 2-wheel cart, and I was pulling the cart, and 2 of my friends were pushing it. And when the helicopter came in, I went flying through the air. I thought we were getting attacked by mortar rounds or something. Long story short, the helicopter had caused a tree to fall, and it fell on the back of the cart. And my best friend, who was RTO for the platoon, he and I set up every night. We would set up together, but he got crushed by the tree that fell as a result of the helicopter coming in. And fortunately for me, I just had the wind knocked out of me, and one of the other guys that was with us just had the wind knocked out of him.
But your friend was killed.
My friend was killed.
And you got wounded, and it was in the middle of a battle, but with friendly fire. How
Friendly
did that
fire.
happen?
Well, we were in combat, and I was with the point element, and we were the backup squad, and lead squad was the point squad. And their radio man, his handset wasn't working correctly, so I took my handset off mine and took it up to him so that he would have communication. It was important for him more than it was me at that time. And when I got up to the front, that's when we got ambushed. And so I just helped funnel ammunition to the point element. And we called in for a helicopter to come in and give us support. And it just happened to be the first rocket that he fired was on top of us, and I just happened to get hit by the shrapnel from the rocket. So
you're hit by a rocket from a Huey helicopter?
I can't actually say for sure, but I'm guessing.
Did you? How do you react to that? I mean, what does that feel? What is that like?
Well, the way it hit me, and I got to reference it to something else. We had a dog at one time that was with us, and the dog got into a bunch of bees, and everybody got stung. Some guys stung so much that they had to be medevaced out. I happened to get stung in the back, and it smarted pretty good. Well, when I got hit with that shrapnel, it was like somebody punched me in the back and set a match to it. Mm. And it was like that bee sting. And I reached for my back, and when I pulled my hand back, my fingers were sliced open from the part that was sticking out of my back. The shrapnel that was sticking out sliced my fingers open. And someone hollered, "Shrapnel," from behind me. And so I reached back carefully that time. I can't reach back like I did then, a little bit bigger. But I wiggled it, and I got it to come out. And it was about 2-3 inches long, and it was stuck in about 1.5 inches or so. And I was able to wiggle it and get it out.
How did they medevac you by helicopter?
Well, and I just threw it on the ground. Well, at the end of the combat, 3 of us had been wounded. One guy had shrapnel in his knee from a hand grenade. Another guy had a bullet went in on one side and was sticking out on his other side. You could see the bullet tip sticking out and a trickle of blood every now and then I had my shrapnel in the back. So the helicopter was called in, but it couldn't land because we were in dense jungle. So they dropped what's called a jungle penetrator. And that's where they drop a cable, and then at the bottom of the cable is this little apparatus that folds out into a seat, and it straps you in. And out of the 3 of us, I was the 3rd guy to go. And I didn't want to go. I was too scared. I said, "Nah, my wound is fine, I'm fine," but the medic said, "Nah, you got to leave. We don't know if there's any more metal in there. We don't know what's going on. You got to go back and get x-rayed." So I just left everything I had right there on the ground, and once you leave your materials, everybody rips through and takes anything and everything that is of value and throws the rest away. And then I got hoisted up, and I never had to go back to the field again. I was lucky.
Well, lucky with a wound. That was sounds awful. But you told me earlier that you served in headquarters. You served in Army intelligence. You remained in Vietnam until your tour was up, and then back home. And you along the way met your wife in the Red Cross in Vietnam, Alan Nagy, and married her. And back in the States, you pursued a very long and successful career in education, and eventually came to work at Coastal Carolina University for a while, and later then retired once, and then moved into the management and construction industry. And so nobody's going to accuse you of being lazy, right?
I don't think so. That was something my dad instilled in me, that you worked, and he had businesses where people worked Monday through Friday. We worked 7 days a week because he had a bowling alley or a theater at first, then a bowling alley, and then we had a canoe livery where we rented canoes out for people. So we were working 7 days a week. We didn't have any time off, so I was used to that.
Well, that work ethic served you well. And we want to thank you for joining us on this program. We want to thank you for your service to our country.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we want to thank you, too, for joining us for Military Memoirs.
The preceding program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. By PGBA, the health claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations.